You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Glad to have you aboard once again. Well, new perspectives for you this week on the profit prospects in crop production here in 2018. Dan O'Brien of K-State Research and Extension has just put together a new set of crop production break-even budgets, and we'll dig into those today. Dan, as you know, is a grain market economist for K-State based in northwest Kansas. So, Dan, you have put together all sorts of numbers here to give us a handle on just what, if any, profitability might be realized from our crop production this year, and noting here that you have worked on the irrigated side initially, right?
Yes. We've looked at how yields and costs and net returns would vary based on amount of water applied. So we have a set of irrigated budgets running from 11 to 14.5 to 17 inches applied, and then calculating total costs and comparing that to forward contract prices that are available on this day in Colby. Done the same type of exercise in the Garden City area in southwest Kansas, Concordia for irrigated corn in that part of the world, and also for Pratt. Have also looked at grain sorghum under irrigation, and looked at irrigated soybeans also. Again, using forward contract prices in those regions to match the budgets, and again, these forward contract prices are what's found publicly reported. They're, quote, bids off of, in this case, happens to be DTN, that we can compare against the costs and see what we have. If there's a surprise to me, as we've tried to be fair-minded and conservative on the amount of profitability that you'd have, that the break-even costs on our budgets are not as high as a person might think, especially under irrigation if you get good yield.
Well, Dan, let's walk through this crop by crop, if we might, because, as you say, in a blanket sense, the break-even potential here may be a bit better than would be thought at first blush by a number of producers. Looking at corn once again, the range of break-evens you've come up with here, and again, this is at 4 points around the western two-thirds of Kansas.
Yeah, break-even cost per bushel under our irrigated budgets of about $3.43 to $3.70, and that includes a land cost. Now, again, a person can pay higher land charges than if you're in a highly competitive area than what we show, but again, with yields from 210 to 265, then at 210, 370 break even, at 240, 354, and at 265, 343. Forward contract prices yesterday in Colby about 348. So at the high yield side, we were even, quote, covering costs, which is a great thing to cover full costs, making about $10 to $12 an acre. Looking at southwest Kansas, again, with pumping amounts ranging from 12 to 18 inches, 12, 15.5, and 18 yields, 195, 225, 250. Break-evens, again, at 195, about $3.80, $3.80. 360 at 225, 347 at 250. Forward contract bids yesterday in Garden City at 378. So at 378, the 225 and the 250 scenarios are, they're covering costs. They're not making tremendous profits, but they're at least at the level now of covering costs by our budgets. Concordia for irrigated corn, north central part of the state, you're looking at yields from 225 to 240 to 260 with amounts pumped of 10 to 13.5 to 16, and really a little bit lower, 10, 15, 20 cent cost of production differential, based mainly on, again, not having to pull water from quite the depths in the north central part of the state under center pivot irrigation that we are out into the west. And in that situation, with forward contract bids of about 343, right around Concordia, new crop bids, we're seeing the 260 scenario, 260 bushel an acre scenario, almost exactly on costs, and the other numbers a little bit lower, 350, 357. For center pivot irrigated corn down south central Kansas, 180 bushels, 210, 240, again, irrigation amounts, 8, 12, 16 is what we've got in our budgets. Break-even numbers at 180 bushels, about $4.11, but by the time you get to 240, you're down to 373. So these aren't gangbuster profits, but with break-even costs for the most part running from $3.50 to $4, it's not inconceivable at all that if we're not covering costs now with some type of a positive move in response to worries about the crop or whatever report might come along, it's not inconceivable that if we get good yields like this, that you could see us being able to cover break-even costs and make some money on irrigated corn. So that's a positive thing.
And again, you have worked up budgets for the western third of Kansas for irrigated grain sorghum. That's not nearly as friendly as it would look for corn, but nonetheless, it may be beyond what folks have been thinking so far.
Yes, this year in our irrigated grain sorghum budgets, we made a determined, conscious effort to make sure that we are trying to represent the irrigated grain sorghum yields fairly relative to what their actual production is, and not just what average USDA NASS numbers are showing. If on a lot of our irrigated acreage in western Kansas for years we've been growing mainly corn, then except on really tight water situations, well, gracious, then the average yields for NASS are going to tend to be lower than what we could have gotten if on a fair, objective basis we were growing grain sorghum to see what we could get max-wise on yields. So anyway, in, say, southwest Kansas in particular, at 9 inches per acre, we've got 150 bushel yield. At 11, 174. At 13 inches, 190 bushels. And we've got break-even numbers at the 150 bushel per acre level of, say, $4.18. At 174, 392. At 190 bushels, 380. Well, yeah, current forward contract bids are in the Garden City area around, say, 349. Well, yeah, we're not covering costs, but gracious, it wouldn't take a lot, 21 cents worth, 25 cents worth, a move to the higher side that the grain sorghum budgets, even at these yields, would be covering costs and making some money under irrigation. Now, what will really be interesting will be a week or so down the road when we're able to come back and look at the dryland side and see how relative profitability of these crops stack up at that time.
Which we intend to do as those budgets are put together. What about the irrigated soybean side then in more detail here? Once more, this is looking relatively favorable for that irrigated bean grower.
A fair question. When you put beans under irrigation, western Kansas, what do you expect for yields? Mm-hmm. You really don't expect 40 bushel an acre. You don't, right. Or even 50. If you're putting beans under center pivot, you're aiming for 65, 75 bushels per acre. So on our budget, northwest Kansas running from 9 to 11 to 13 inches applied, we're looking at 55 on the low side to 65 to 75. Putting 75 bushels per acre is a yield goal out there. And with that, looking at forward contract bids of about $8.74 in Colby yesterday, break-even costs at 75 bushel an acre, $8.71 by our numbers, at 65, $9.28. So we'd be covering projected costs at 75 bushels per acre, below cost by about $30 an acre at 65. Again, it wouldn't take that much for the current forward contract bids of $8.74 to become $9.28. But again, it's not there at the moment. Southwest Kansas, yields running from 55 to 61 to 67, again with 9, 11, 13 inches applied. And break-even costs at 67 bushels, about $8.94, about $9.31 for 61 bushels. And with forward contract bid in Garden City yesterday of $8.95, well, at 67 bushels an acre, you're covering costs, but below it at 61. So you're kind of on the knife's edge there. Mm-hmm. Concordia, north central Kansas, yields from 55 to 65 to 75, 9, 11, 13 inches applied. Break-even cost per bushel at 75 bushel an acre, about $8.72. Well, at $9.14 forward contract bid at $8.72 costs, that's a projection of at least covering your costs. Not making outlandish profits, but at least covering your costs. South central Kansas, again, 55, 61, 67 bushels per acre. Forward contract bid, $9.14 in the Pratt area. A break-even number right now of about $9.54. That's at 67 bushels an acre. Again, from $9.14 to $9.54, it wouldn't take a lot of concern crop-wise for us to see movement higher to $9.54 in the incoming months and above, and then being able to cover costs. So an interesting, I hope, and useful exercise, and really the type of a set of numbers that people can look at for comparison's sake, to their own numbers to give them some idea of the type of forward contract, new crop bid prices that they need to start being serious about taking some action in terms of locking down prices for 2018 harvest.
And for reference purposes, you have posted these budgets on agmanager.info, right, Dan?
Yes. Again, the irrigated numbers are up there now. Within the next week or so, we intend to have the dry land numbers along with it.
Well, again, great work, Dan, on these irrigated cropping break-even budgets that producers can use to see if there are, in fact, pricing opportunities that might be on the horizon, if not here already. And we'll talk again next Friday and bring up those dry land budgets as they've come together. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. We feature his remarks every Friday here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today. When you bring up the term cover crops anymore, it seems to generate a great deal of interest amongst producers out there. One of the promoted values of cover crops would be as a builder of soil health. Our guest now has been on the meeting circuit for Extension over the winter and will probably continue through the year, talking about cover crops and how they contribute to the betterment of our soils. DeAnn Presley is a soil management specialist with K-State Research and Extension. In fact, you just finished a meeting earlier this week in north central Kansas on this topic, and it's pretty obvious that cover crops do contribute to soil health, DeAnn.
Yeah, so at our meeting this week, there were other speakers. So another person focused on cover crops and the nutrient relationships, and another person focused on grazing cover crops. And so I focused more into the soil health aspect. So when people talk about soil health, you know, this conversation could go a few different ways, but one of the sort of generally accepted definitions is, does your soil do what you want it to do? Does it not erode? Does it drain well? You know, how's the soil organic matter in it? So there's sort of these 3 things that we can group measurements into. So physical, chemical, and biological. Now, there are certainly a lot of places you can send soil samples to be tested right now. Different labs have set up different testing packages. Of course, there's actually some things that you can do yourself. So there's a document called the USDA, it's NRCS's Soil Health Test Kit, and it's got some simple things you can do to measure infiltration, for example, how stable the aggregates are. So there's just lots of ways you can go with this. So what I generally do is present my own data from different experiments I've done where we've measured the physical things, like I said, the infiltration, how well does it accept water, how well does that soil drain, and then the biological is something I work on with other people, but you can do some simple measurements of respiration, so how much biological activity is there in a 24-hour period. You can do other things that are more elaborate, so you can determine who's in the soil, so things about the bacteria, the fungi, actinomycetes, the protozoa, all those things by sending soils off to a lab as well. And then the chemical, of course, is always a piece of that. So the idea being, if you have a healthy soil, it's going to function well in all of those ways. It's going to have a balance of microbes and have a lot of microbes. And it's going to do those, physical properties well. So accept water rather than erode sediment off. And then the chemical as well. If you have a well-functioning soil, there should be some pretty good chemical cycling by the microbes. So those are sort of the principles of soil health.
There's a lot going on there, obviously. So when you then bring it back to cover crops selection and utilization for promoting soil health, each cover crop will contribute to those 3 principles in a different way, will they not?
They could. So sometimes people ask me about, what's your favorite cover crop for soil health? Or in general, I say, well, jokingly, anything with roots on it is pretty good. So there's this principle of conservation agriculture, and it talks about there's sort of 3 pillars of conservation agriculture. 1 is reduce soil disturbance. 2 is keeping a soil covered for more of the year, and 3 is bringing in some crop diversity. Well, one could do the crop diversity piece through having a more diverse crop rotation. 3 crop rotation instead of 2 crop rotation would be good. But let's say you have a 2 crop rotation that you like. If you could fit cover crops into a window between those 2 crops, well, great. You've kind of gotten at that one principle of an increased diversity in your rotation. And of course, cover. Erosion is just going to become an increasing concern, I think. You would think, well, with no-till, we've solved that problem. Well, I would say go look at some fields, and you'll see that there are problems, even with the structures like we have. So waterways, terraces, and things of that nature, we still need to stop sediment from leaving fields, and we need to stop, nutrient-laden water from leaving fields as well. And cover crops just do a really good job of that, so keeping the soil protected. And then, of course, the water dynamic comes up. Well, they use water. Yes, they do. But then they do a great job conserving water in the summertime. So it's a pleasant place to be on top of old cover crop residue in a field if you have to be in a cornfield in July, because you can really feel it, how much evaporation is being reduced, and because of that soil temperature being reduced. And there's work being done by many people at K-State, including me and other people, measuring that water dynamic. There is a point at which you can get too little rainfall, though, where that doesn't work. So, I'm more familiar with the eastern half of the state, and I think cover crops can do a pretty good job at doing this water dynamic sort of thing I'm talking about, recovering the water and then conserving it in the summertime. Once you get to the western half of the state, first of all, I don't do a lot of work out there, though there are others at K-State who do. But they'll definitely be a little more cautious about where you can put a cover crop in a rotation. And I always say this when talking about cover crops is you have to decide what your objective it is. Right. They're not a magical end-all, be-all sort of thing that can do anything you want. There's a trade-off. And so finding a spot for it in your rotation where it can work. You don't want to just shove a square peg in a round hole. I've tried that. You don't always get a lot of growth when you do that. But also, what is it that you want to do, and does that affect your cropping system goals as a whole? So it really depends on your goal. But if your goal is soil health, any cover crop that fits in that window is going to help a lot.
There's likely a perception out there to build quality in your soil, that a legume might have an advantage in regard to providing a nitrogen resource for that soil. Is there anything to that?
Well, legumes are definitely great, especially if you're adding them into a crop rotation where there isn't a legume. That's going to be a great thing for the soil microbiological community. As far as needing a legume, I've seen a lot of benefits from having cereal crops in a rotation. So cereal crops are a great cover crop. They do build soil as well. They have fibrous root systems, so they hold soil well from an erosion standpoint. A lot of our cereal crops, we will terminate those before they ever go reproductive. That's definitely a good plan. So if you think of something like, a cereal rye, the straw is going to have this really high C to N ratio. Well, it depends when you terminate it. You terminate that when it's pretty green and maybe short, like less than a foot. That residue is not actually going to last as long as you think, because it is, the carbon to nitrogen ratio is fairly narrow. But still, you've got a lot of biological activity that you've stimulated by having roots growing as they decompose. First of all, as they're growing, there's things feeding off the root exudates, but then as they decompose, there's lots of, the whole food web is getting supported, things feeding off the freshly decaying material, and then higher organisms feeding off of those organisms. So really, any cover crop is going to have some benefits. Certainly, if you're after nitrogen, fixing some of your own nitrogen, that's where legumes would play the main role.
But in closing here, because there are so many alternatives, mixes, options to consider, you would urge producers to tap into what you and your associates in the Department of Agronomy have developed in the way of information on cover crop performance for both eastern and western Kansas.
Yes, and so there's been a lot of work going on. I can think back to 2006 is when most of the cover crop experiments that are currently going on started up. And so a lot of us have now been through a few cycles of the crop rotation. We're starting to work on really getting that written up. As far as the agronomic soil health stuff, it's still coming out. We're all giving presentations on it as far as the actual documents, extension documents. A lot of that would be in some of the annual reports that you can find on it would be on the K-State Research and Extension website. You can link to the agricultural reports and find a lot of that there. And then there is a tool that we've worked with as far as, selection of cover crops that is actually housed on the Midwest Cover Crops Council website, which is a consortium of universities. It's actually also there are people from the seed industry that work on that, and there's people from government agencies, certainly. It's a really collaborative thing, and so Kansas is one of the drop-down choices that's been there about 2 years now, so it's actually getting a lot of use. So you can play around with that and see, okay, this is my location. Second of all, this is my crop rotation and my planting and harvesting dates. It's nice because it's interactive. It takes away some of the options as soon as you make some of those decisions. And so that can be helpful, although I think we have 50-something on that list, and there's more than 50-something cover crops. But, that's where working with local seed dealers selling cover crops is really useful because they'll have knowledge of what some successful scenarios locally have been, too. So I would say it's very multidisciplinary right now. Disciplinary in terms of, we've got engineers working on it, agronomy people working on it, entomologists are very interested in cover crops from what can pollinators do. We haven't even tapped into the weed science sort of aspect of cover crops because there's a lot going on there as well. But
Suffice it to say, information is not lacking.
No, really, and there's so many different combinations of experiments. But we need to get it all organized in one spot, and that's a project I've been working on for a while, is to kind of get a web page assembled with at least what are K-State people doing.
You bet. But a couple of sources, the Agronomy Department website, agronomy.ksu.edu, or as DeAnn says, do check out the Midwest Cover Crops Council's site, which has that drop-down menu for the various states, including Kansas, and suggestions on cover crops for our state. It's still a hot-button topic, as evidenced by the tremendous interest in cover crops yet out there. So, DeAnn, thank you for coming over, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Soil management specialist, K-State Research and Extension, who's been speaking on cover crops as a contributor to soil health. That's DeAnn Presley. We'll be back shortly on this Agriculture Today.
Trade was a leading topic at the Kansas Commodity Classic on January 26th. Kansas Senators Pat Roberts and Jerry Moran gave insight into the administration's views on the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Senator Roberts chairs the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. He commented on the state of the agriculture economy and how important trade policy is to the economy. He said, "We're in a rough patch. This is the third year in a row, as you know, with a supply-demand situation, plus a situation in Washington where our trade policy has yet really to be determined. I think that's probably the most important thing we can do in Washington, both Democrat and Republican, to insist on a robust and positive trade policy." NAFTA has been beneficial to the Kansas and U.S. agriculture economies. According to keynote speaker Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, people don't talk enough about the benefits of the agreement. He said NAFTA created a net of jobs in this country, good jobs. If you take the number of jobs, you multiply it by the wages and salaries of those jobs, NAFTA has had a net positive on job creation. He said you just don't hear that. NAFTA is unique. It works for all three, U.S., Mexico, and Canada. Mexico and Canada are now in the top 3 of our customers, along with China. Flinchbaugh said if we pull the plug on NAFTA, we're going to lose those markets to Brazil, Argentina, and Europe. And once you lose them, it's tough to get them back. He said now the president is on record saying he supports NAFTA, and we have to hold his feet to the fire. We simply cannot let him pull that plug. President Trump recently said that he would reconsider the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Senator Moran told attendees, "I was pleased to hear President Trump talk about TPP and that we'd be glad to be a participant." According to U.S. Wheat Associates, the TPP-11 agreement that moves forward without the United States puts U.S. wheat producers at a total price disadvantage of more than $200 million per year. Moran said we need to be a participant, whatever the trade agreement is. If we're going to move to bilateral, we need to see those negotiations on those trade agreements now, this year, this past year. and those discussions are not taking place. Roberts agreed, stating maybe Humpty Dumpty hasn't been pushed so far over that we can't put him back up and participate in TPP, and certainly with NAFTA that we don't have to do the same kind of situation. Both senators called for farmers to continue weighing in with their comments and concerns on trade. Moran said, "We have a lot at stake, and I would encourage all of you to continue the effort. Don't think that this issue is going away or has gone away. It's real, and the consequences are serious." For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Topping off this agriculture today, we get into the Kansas agricultural weather scene once more, as Mike's side is Mary Knapp, research and extension climatologist here at K-State. It's the same refrain, Mary, by and large, from last week and the week before and the week before. Moisture has been largely absent in the state, except for a couple of isolated spots, right?
Right, and we didn't really get the moisture even that we had last week. Last week it was confined to the northwest, but they got substantial moisture out of the system. This week it was that same system leaving Kansas down in the southeastern portion of the state, but the average moisture that they managed to squeeze out of that exiting system was much less, and we're talking heaviest amounts less than 1/4 of an inch. So the divisional average was about 1/100 of an inch. The only division that had actually a measurable average on their precipitation, so again, an indication of how dry the rest of the state was. But it's also worth noting that when you look at departure from normal, even with that moisture that they had in southeast Kansas, they had the biggest deficit, keeping in mind that southeast tends to see more moisture during the winter season, so it's much harder for them to get enough to be at normal. In the rest of the state, the amounts that we see during the winter are fairly low. So out west, if you had a dry week, you've added 1/10 of an inch to your deficit, whereas in southeast Kansas, that could be a day's deficit.
Too many places in Kansas zeroed out on moisture for several weeks running, and that means that our drought status just continues to worsen.
Right, and that was also aggravated by the fact that this week, unlike last, we were warmer than normal, so that meant a little bit more evaporative loss going with that. So we did have an expansion of the moderate and the severe drought, which of course meant the amount that's still in abnormally dry has shrunk. We did see a little expansion of the extreme drought, but not as much. It takes quite a bit to push you into that extreme category, and so that really didn't move as much as did the severe drought. Really was what took a big jump, covering most of central Kansas now into parts of north central Kansas and moving in a little bit into the eastern part of the state. And people can check on our drought update on the Kansas Climate page, and we have that updated every week, and that'll have all that information plus a link to the U.S. Drought Monitor for the current week in Kansas.
Up and down temperatures this week once more.
Right, and again, that goes hand in glove with that drier air mass that is in play. Hugoton had the unfortunate honor of having the warmest temperature in that southwest division at 73. They also had the coldest temperature at 9 degrees, and it was 24 hours apart. So again, you get that really big temperature swing. And divisionally, you look across all of the divisions, the diurnal variation, or the variation between the high and low, was over 50 degrees. Typically at this time of the year, you would expect it somewhere more like 23 degrees, so about double what we would expect at this time. That does have some positives in it. Basically, with those low temperatures in the nighttime, we're not going to see those winter crops break dormancy as readily as they would have if those low temperatures were staying more elevated. We're getting into the longer day lengths now, so that buffer is going to be removed, because when you look particularly at winter wheat, it's not just the temperature, but it's the day length that triggers a loss of that winter dormancy. So the longer that we can keep those winter crops into dormancy, the less evaporative demand there will be from that crop. The other thing is the less vulnerable it will be to those cold temperatures that we are going to have before we get to the end of our winter season.
So then the outlook, and as we peer to this next week, well, they're talking about a chance for snowfall midweek, but will it be much more than a dusting? That seems to be at debate right now.
Right. When they're looking at the forecast, they've got a number of models that they look at in order to gauge what the systems will do, and they're not in agreement. And so depending upon which model does a better job of predicting the path and track of these storms, it will have a big difference. In some cases, it's looking at, well, we might get a dusting. And the other cases, it's looking like, oh, we're going to get dumped on. The question will be just how does this storm behave as it comes through? There is a slight chance for some snow in eastern Kansas on Sunday into Monday, but not really a very significant chance. The system is going to be a northern system tracking in. There's not much residual moisture in place for it to work with. So you might see a few flakes, but it's unlikely to be as productive as the storm that ended January out in the northwest, where they had 14 plus inches of snow and an inch of moisture out of it. Not looking like that's in the cards for this weekend. Will it come for the Wednesday storm? Not very high confidence that we'll get that kind of moisture. The quantitative precip forecast basically is looking at less than 1/4 of an inch statewide for our weekly total ending next Friday. If we get anything, we'll take it, but we need a bigger shift. Again, what we're really looking for is that ridge in the west to break down, get some systems coming along southern California and tracking out through the southern plains. The other option would be for that Gulf moisture that is currently streaming up through the east to back a little bit further west and come up through Texas and Oklahoma. Neither pattern looks like it's in the immediate future, and so we'll just have to watch and see what comes with that.
And that holds for the longer range forecast into the latter part of the month, you say?
Well, at least in the 8 to 14 day, it is below normal temperatures and drier than normal conditions statewide. What comes after that, if we get a shift in the Madden-Julian oscillation, or if we get a shift in the polar vortex, a number of those patterns that are on shorter terms than the La Nina could signal a different trend for us here in the Central Plains. But as it stands now, it looks like more of the same, which is basically wide temperature swings, a lot of wind, and very dry conditions, which of course means high fire danger and not much encouragement on reduction in the drought.
All right. Mary, we always appreciate the word. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
She's along with us each week from the Weather Data Library here at K-State. Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. And we appreciate you being along with us as well. Enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.